All right, Cubs, we are here on day 5 of this week, at least, of our read aloud, and we are starting a new chapter, chapter 15, The Forbidden Forest. And let's take a moment to recap or retell what's happened really recently in our story. We know that, yes, Harry and Hermione got rid of Norbert, the dragon, so that Hagrid might be okay. But unfortunately, they left the invisibility cloak at the top of the astronomy tower. And because they did this, they got caught by Mr. Filch, the caretaker. And so now we're going to find out what happens. You guys had a lot of great predictions. Most of your predictions were they're going to get expelled, kicked out of school. They're going to lose points. They're going to get detention. They're going to get in big trouble. I think those are all great predictions. So let's see if your predictions come true. Things couldn't have been worse. Filch took them down to Professor McGonagall's study on the first floor, where they sat and waited without saying a word to each other. Hermione was trembling. Excuses, alibis, and wild cover-up stories chased each other around Harry's brain, each more feeble than the last. He couldn't see how they were going to get out of trouble this time. They were cornered. How could they have been so stupid as to forget the cloak? There was no reason on earth that Professor McGonagall would accept for their being out of bed and creeping around the school in the dead of night, let alone being up in the tallest astronomy tower, which was out of bounds except for classes. And Norbert and the invisibility cloak, and they might as well add Norbert and the invisibility cloak, and they might as well be packing their bags already. Had Harry thought that things couldn't have been worse? He was wrong. When Professor McGonagall appeared, she was leading Neville. "Harry!" Neville burst out at the moment he saw the other two. "I was trying to warn you. I heard Malfoy saying he was going to catch you. He said that you had a drag." Harry shook his head violently to shut Neville up, but Professor McGonagall had seen. She looked more likely to breathe fire than Norbert as she towered over the three of them. So if a teacher is going to breathe fire, that's a great figurative language comparing that teacher to a dragon. So a teacher is going to breathe fire. We know that that means she's very angry. That's right. So when I read this, I've got to read it like she's angry, right? But I don't think that Professor McGonagall will get super loud. We'll see. I would never have believed it of any of you. Mr. Filch said you were up in the astronomy tower. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. Explain yourselves. It was the first time Hermione had ever failed to answer a teacher's question. She was staring at her slippers, as still as a statue. "I think I've got a good idea of what's been going on," said Professor McGonagall. "It doesn't take a genius to work it out. You fed Draco Malfoy some cock and bull story about a dragon, trying to get him out of bed and into trouble. I've already caught him. I suppose you think it's funny that Longbottom here heard the story and believed it too." Harry caught Neville's eye and tried to tell him without words that this wasn't true, but Neville was looking stunned and hurt. Poor, blundering Neville. Harry knew what it must have cost him to try to find them in the dark, to warn them. "I'm disgusted," said Professor McGonagall. 4 students out of bed in one night. I've never heard such a thing before. You, Miss Granger, I thought you had more sense. As for you, Mr. Potter, I thought Gryffindor meant more to you than this. All 3 of you will receive detentions. Yes, you too, Mr. Longbottom. Nothing gives you the right to walk around school at night, especially these days. It's dangerous. And 50 points will be taken from Gryffindor." 50? Harry gasped. They would lose the lead he'd won in the last Quidditch match. 50 points each, said Professor McGonagall, breathing heavily through her long pointed nose. "Professor, please, you can't." "Don't Oh, excuse me. Professor, please must be somebody else. Professor, please. You can't. Don't tell me what I can and can't do, Potter. Now, get back to bed, all of you. I've never been more ashamed of Gryffindor students. 150 points lost. That put Gryffindor in last place. In one night, they'd ruined any chance Gryffindor had for the House Cup. Harry felt as though the bottom had dropped out of his stomach. How could they ever make up for this? Harry didn't sleep all night. He could hear Neville sobbing into his pillow for what seemed like hours. Harry couldn't think of anything to say to comfort him. He knew Neville, like himself, was dreading dawn. What would happen when the rest of Gryffindor found out what they'd done? At first, Gryffindors passing the giant hourglasses that recorded the house points the next day thought there had been a mistake. How could they suddenly have 150 points fewer than yesterday? Oh, that must be... I guess that's what the hourglass looks like. And then the story started to spread. Harry Potter, the famous Harry Potter, their hero of 2 Quidditch matches, had lost them all those points. Him and a couple of other stupid first years. From being one of the most popular and admired people at school, Harry was suddenly the most hated. Even Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs turned on him because everybody had been longing to see Slytherin lose the House Cup. Everywhere Harry went, people pointed and didn't trouble to lower their voices as they insulted him. Slytherins, on the other hand, clapped as he walked past them, whistling and cheering. "Thanks, Potter, we owe you one." Only Ron stood by him. "They'll all forget about this in a few weeks. Fred and George have lost loads of points in all the time they've been here, and people still like them." "They've never lost 150 points in one go, though, have they?" said Harry miserably. "Well, no," Ron admitted. It was a bit late to repair the damage, but Harry swore to himself not to meddle in things that weren't his business from now on. He'd had it with sneaking around and spying. He felt so ashamed of himself that he went to Wood and offered to resign from the Quidditch team. "Resign?" I'm sorry, wrong voice. "Resign?" Wood thundered. "What good'll that do? How are we going to get any points back if we can't win at Quidditch?" But even Quidditch had lost its fun. The rest of the team wouldn't speak to Harry during practice, and if they had to speak to him, they called him the Seeker. Hermione and Neville were suffering too. They didn't have as bad of a time as Harry because they weren't as well known, but nobody would speak to them either. Hermione had stopped drawing attention to herself in class, keeping her head down and working in silence. Harry was almost glad the exams weren't far away. All the revision he had to do kept his mind off of his misery. He, Ron, and Hermione kept to themselves, working late into the night, trying to remember the ingredients in complicated potions, learning charms and spells off by heart, memorized the dates of magical discoveries and goblin rebellions. Then, about a week before the exams were due to start, Harry's new resolution not to interfere with anything that didn't concern him was put to an unexpected test. He was walking back from the library on his own one afternoon and heard someone whimpering in a classroom up ahead. As he drew closer, it was Quirrell's voice. Uh-oh. "No, no, not again, please." It sounded as though someone was threatening him. Harry moved closer. All right, he heard Quirrell sob. The next second, Quirrell came hurrying out of the classroom, straightening his turban. He was pale and looked as though he was about to cry. He strode out of sight. Harry didn't think Quirrell had even noticed him. He waited until Quirrell's footsteps had disappeared. Then he peered into the classroom. It was empty, but a door stood ajar at the other end. Harry was halfway towards it before he remembered what he'd promised himself about not meddling. All the same, he'd gambled 12 Sorcerer's Stones that Snape had just left the room, and from what Harry had heard, Snape would be walking with a new spring in his step. Quirrell seemed to be given in at last. Harry went back to the library where Hermione was testing Ron on astronomy, and Harry told them what he heard. "Snape's done it then," said Ron. "If Quirrell's told him how to break his anti-dark fast. and stay dark for a spell. There's still Fluffy, though, said Hermione. Maybe Snape's found out how to get past him without asking Hagrid, said Ron, looking up at thousands of books surrounding them. I bet there's a book somewhere in here telling you how to get past a giant three-headed dog. So what do we do, Harry? The light of adventure was kindling in Ron's eyes, but Hermione answered before Harry could. Go to Dumbledore. That's what we should have done ages ago. If we try anything ourselves, we'll be thrown out for sure. But we've got no proof, said Harry. Quirrell's too scared to back us up. Snape's only got to say he doesn't know how the troll got in Halloween, and that he was nowhere near the third floor. Who do you think they'll believe, him or us? It's not exactly a secret we hate him. Dumbledore will think we made it up to get him sacked. Filch wouldn't help us if his life depended on it. He's too friendly with Snape. And the more students get thrown out, the better, he'll think. And don't forget, we're not supposed to know about the stone or Fluffy. And that'll take a lot of explaining. Hermione looked convinced, but Ron didn't. Ooh, we've got a big picture of Professor McGonagall for you to see. If we do just a bit of poking around... No, said Harry flatly. We've done enough poking around. He pulled a map of Jupiter towards him and started to learn the name of the moons. So, we're going to stop there because there's a little passage of time here. But I will actually, you know what? I'll read this one little part. The following morning, notes were delivered to Harry, Hermione, and Neville at the breakfast table. They were all the same. Your detention will take place at 11 o'clock tonight. Meet Mr. Filch in the entrance hall. Professor M. McGonagall. So we're going to stop there. So we know that Harry and Hermione and Neville all have detention. And we're going to see what that detention is. What do you think they're going to have to do if they're going to meet Mr. Filch in the entrance hall at 11 o'clock tonight? That's 11 p.m. That's close to midnight. What are they going to do? Remember the title of our chapter, The Forbidden Forest? How do you think the Forbidden Forest comes into this chapter? And another thing you could predict is, do you really think that Harry, Ron, and Hermione are going to stop exploring and being adventurous? All right. Thanks for listening, guys.